If you were a kid in Australia any time between the 80s and early to mid 2000s, your afternoons probably followed a sacred ritual. A glass of Cottee's cordial, half a pack of Tiny Teddies, and bananas in pajamas sprinting down the stairs like it was the Game of Thrones finale. Minus the dragons, but arguably more chaos. Turn on the TV and you'd find shows that felt like home, accents you recognized, jokes your parents didn't get, and puppets that somehow weren't terrifying. Fast forward to now, try finding a new Aussie-made kids show on TV. Spoiler alert, you'll have better luck finding a working dial-up modem or a sane Twitter thread. So, what happened? What the hell happened to Australian children's television? Tune in as we dig deep and talk about how and why Australia's kids' TV almost ceases to exist in the modern day. Once upon a time, Aussie Kids TV wasn't just good, it was the gold standard. Weird, wonderful, and deeply local. Shows like Round the Twist were so bizarre and iconic, they've basically been etched into Australia's collective DNA, right next to magpies, meat pies, and political implosions. Back in 2008, the industry was cranking out 605 hours of new kids drama. That's enough to keep your Saturday morning brain fully occupied until you hit puberty, or developed an opinion about Neighbours. But it wasn't just screen time filler. These shows felt ours. They sounded like us. They looked like our cul-de-sacs, our public schools, our sometimes deeply regrettable surfwear. Instead of being drip-fed Californian accents and overly sanitized plots, Aussie kids were watching a literal puppet couch teach them emotional intelligence. And somehow, it worked. Then, the 2010s rolled in, and the industry began to quietly collapse. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Like a sandcastle at Bondi, right before some kid with a boogie board turns it into modern art. In 2008, Australia produced 605 hours of original children's drama. By 2020, just 96 hours. That's an 84% nosedive, faster than a home and away character getting killed off mid-contract renewal. So, what happened? Let's break it down like the Australian TV budget. First, the commercial networks tapped out. Once upon a time, 7, 9, and 10 were required by law to produce and broadcast children's content. It was part of their license obligations, Australian content quotas set by the Australian Communications and Media Authority, a little thing called giving kids local stories. But by the 2010s, the commercial networks started pulling the plug, quietly reducing output, cutting budgets, and pushing reruns like it was a gym infomercial at 2 a.m. Their excuse? Kids don't watch free to air anymore, which is technically true. But also, when you stop serving food, don't act surprised when no one shows up to dinner. There's a difference between kids leaving TV and being left behind. Then we also have that incident where the government pulled the plug. In 2020, Morrison government decides to tidy up a bit, specifically by scrapping the quotas altogether. No more legally enforced minimum hours for kids' drama, animation, or factual content on commercial networks. No obligation to make content that reflects Australian kids, their voices, or their realities. No penalties, no incentives, no follow-up, just vibes. In government speak, it was called modernizing the content regulations. In reality, it was deregulation dressed up in a press release and quietly handed to the networks with a wink and a nod. This change, by the way, came right after years of lobbying by media companies arguing that producing children's content was too expensive, too niche, and not commercially viable. Which simply means that they can make more money showing reruns of Border Security. And last but perhaps the biggest reason of all, streaming took over. Then, as if things weren't already sliding downhill on a go-kart with no brakes, along came the streamers. Kids moved en masse to YouTube, Netflix, and Disney+, where they could binge on demand and skip ads faster than a dad with a universal remote. But here's the catch. Unlike Aussie broadcasters, streaming platforms weren't, and still aren't, required to produce or carry Australian content. There were no local content quotas, no funding obligations, and no pressure to reflect anything remotely local, unless Bluey happened to sneak through. The result? A digital flood of American and British programming, algorithmic sugar, bright colors, fast cuts, and voices that sound like every Nickelodeon audition ever. Meanwhile, local creators were left shouting into the void with no funding, no airtime, and no realistic path to compete. So, congratulations, your child can now sing the Cocomelon intro in their sleep. But they have absolutely no idea who Blinky Bill is. They can tell you Peppa Pig's entire family tree, but couldn't spot Possum Magic on a bookshelf if it jumped out and ate their Vegemite toast. And then there was Bluey. Launched in 2018 by Ludo Studio in Brisbane and funded by the ABC and BBC, Bluey became Australia's most unlikely cultural export since Vegemite sandwiches and passive aggression. Here's what makes Bluey different. First, it's Australian, unapologetically so. It also features actual parenting, not sitcom parenting. And lastly, it treats kids like intelligent beings, not future consumers. But make no mistake, Bluey is a unicorn. It's a runaway success built off public funding, artistic freedom, and good old-fashioned storytelling. It didn't come from a market trend or a corporate brainstorm. And according to Swinburne University's 2024 study, parents are noticing that there's literally nothing else like it. One parent told researchers, "The only Aussie show I can think of that my kid watches is Bluey. That's it. I couldn't name a second." Meanwhile, another said, "We've had to resort to Peppa Pig. My 3-year-old now speaks with a British accent. Losing kids' TV isn't just about turning off the telly, it's about turning off a whole pipeline of culture. When we cut kids' TV, we cut accessible learning tools tailored to our kids and their realities, shared generational memories, jobs for local writers, actors, and creators, and maybe the most important of all, representation, especially for Indigenous and multicultural communities." And here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. If we don't fund this stuff when kids are 3, we'll be desperately trying to reintroduce it when they're 13 and already fluent in TikTok trends, but not their own culture. That's not a TV problem. That's a nation building problem. And it's a hell of a lot harder to fix than one busted broadcast schedule. So, is it all doom and digital decay? Not quite. Not yet. There's growing pressure to bring in local content quotas for streaming platforms, so Netflix, Disney Plus, even YouTube would finally have to give Aussie kids content a proper seat at the table. And out there, in co-working spaces and spare bedrooms, there are still indie studios and scrappy creators fighting to tell local stories, trying to build the next Bluey. If they can just secure the funding for, basic survival. And us, the audience, we're still here, watching, waiting, wistfully humming the Round the Twist theme song like it's the national anthem we actually chose. So, we've gone from a time when Aussie kids shows felt like home to a screen full of American accents and algorithm-approved sludge. And while Bluey is doing its absolute best to hold the line, one wholesome episode at a time, it shouldn't have to do it alone. Because here's the truth, if we don't invest in our own stories, someone else will fill the silence. And it turns out, the silence sounds a lot like Peppa Pig. If you grew up with Aussie Kids TV and want the next generation to have their own version of getting weird in a lighthouse, hit like, drop your favorite childhood show in the comments, and share this with someone who still knows the Round the Twist theme by heart. And hey, subscribe. We've got more deep dives on culture, policy, and forgotten gems coming your way, so make sure you hit that bell button too. Also let us know what your favorite one is. And as always, stay curious.